And maybe it's a bit too early to say, but just based off this demo, it seems like Neo 3 is officially safe from being casualized, which seems to be affecting more and more games with each passing year. I mean, I get that Mario Kart is targeted for a younger audience, but I don't think it would make little Timmy's head explode if there was at least a couple difficult tracks. It's like Nintendo tried as hard as they could to make this game as casual as possible. Well, the wait is finally over. After 6 long years, Hollow Knight Silksong has finally come. After being revealed all the way back at the start of 2019, to then Team Cherry going mostly radio silent until 2022, where the game was re-revealed at an Xbox showcase, and it was here that it was revealed that the game would launch within the following 12 months. Well, it's been an incredibly long 12 months, because fast forward to 2025, and Silksong is finally upon us. And while Hollow Knight Silksong may have finally come, sadly, I have not. Because what was almost certainly an easy shoo-in for my 2025 Game of the Year has turned out to be one of the most frustrating gaming experiences that I've had in years. As it would seem that one of Team Cherry's guiding principles when designing Silksong was to make Hollow Knight but harder, which, in theory, I'm on board with. The original Hollow Knight, while not being the most difficult video game that I've ever played, was certainly no cakewalk either, especially when it came to the game's true final boss or the optional White Palace. So it would only make sense for the sequel to ramp up the difficulty then. But unfortunately, Silksong is harder than the original Hollow Knight in all of the worst possible ways. Tedious runbacks, spongy enemies, and a downright broken economy are all things that only scratch the surface of everything wrong with the difficulty in this game. And I'll just go ahead and say this right off the top. But no, by no means do I think Silksong is a bad game. In fact, despite my many frustrations, I think it's quite a good game. But at the same time, I can't shake the feeling that it could have been an even better one had Team Cherry exercised even a modicum of restraint. And it's this lack of restraint that leaves Silksong feeling more tedious than anything else, and not the genuine step up in challenge that it could have been. And so, despite me actually enjoying quite a bit that Silksong has to offer, the combat, art direction, music, and most of the new movement options, this video is instead going to be mostly focused on the negatives. So if you clicked onto this review in the hopes of a fair and balanced analysis, then this is simply not it. But keep in mind that I still enjoy quite a bit about this game all the same. And with that, be sure to lean forward and get your keyboards at the ready, because the first comment that says skill issue is going to get a heart react from yours truly. Here's my review of Hollow Knight Silksong. Silksong begins in a similar fashion to the original Hollow Knight, where our silent protagonist, although silent no longer, arrives in a mysterious land. Enter Farloom, the land of both silk and song. But things are a bit different from our time spent in Hollow Nest, where instead of starting off at the top of the map and having to work our way down, we now start off at the bottom of the map and have to work our way upward. Truly innovative. And while there may be an unshakable sense of familiarity when first setting foot in Farloom, it very quickly becomes evident that things are a bit different this time around, as what would appear to be basic cannon fodder enemies take a surprising amount of hits to defeat. Standard beetle and flying enemies now take 3 hits to kill, whereas the equivalent to these 2 enemy types in the original Hollow Knight only took 2, which not only makes more sense for how early these enemies are encountered in the game, but also for how simplistic their movesets are. I mean, these enemy types in both the original Hollow Knight and Silksong literally just move in a straight line and do nothing else. The chances of the player actually dying to these enemies are quite slim, meaning that inflating the HP values of these enemy types only serves to eat up at more of the player's time. And what's even worse is that some larger enemies can take up to 6 hits to defeat without an upgraded needle. And again, these enemies' movesets aren't any more complicated than just charging at you head first. And the aforementioned larger enemy type does up to 2 masks of damage, Now, double mask damage was very much a thing in the OG Hollow Knight, but it was reserved for specific moves for specific bosses, and wasn't really something that was encountered in the early game. But now in Silksong, we have enemies that deal double mask damage as early as the second area, and is a trend that only gets more and more prevalent the further you progress, which for the later game makes a bit more sense, but for the early game, I'm not quite as convinced, and there's a couple reasons why. There's the obvious point that it's overly punishing for the early game, but also, by the end game, double mask damage is very much the norm, where you're far more likely to have more health as well as more defensive options. And Team Cherry doesn't really raise the stakes any higher and introduce triple mask damage, so in a way, Silksong is at its most difficult within the opening hours, where you only have 5 masks of health, and the enemies do just as much damage now as they do in the endgame, which leads to a pretty lopsided play experience. I'm not at all exaggerating when I say something like Morwing or Sister Splinter are likely to be 2 of the most difficult bosses that you face in the entire game, despite the both of them being relatively early game bosses. Well, if it weren't for some truly sadistic encounters later on. But Sister Splinter gave me quite a bit of trouble in particular. You have to fight her in a fairly cramped arena that only gets more and more cramped the longer the fight goes on, because she keeps spawning these goddamn vines that not only hinder your mobility, but also deal contact damage on top of it. And if that somehow weren't bad enough, halfway through the fight she also starts spawning enemies that, you guessed it, deal double mask damage. But at the very least, friendly fire is turned on. Or even something like the Bell Beast, while being far from the most difficult boss you'll face in Silksong, is also quite a big step up in difficulty from even just the first boss. His charge does 2 masks, the bells he spawns does 2 masks, and contact damage does 2 masks. You would think that for an early game boss like this, they would accommodate for the fact that you don't have many upgrades or any movement abilities, but instead they have him do just as much damage as the final boss in the game. With how common double damage is in this game, they might as well have started you off with only 3 masks, and simply had most enemies only do 1 mask of damage instead, because at the start of the game, you effectively only have 3 hit points anyway. That, or have you start off with 6 masks instead of 5, because starting you off with only 5 masks in this game is quite cruel in particular. Because again, with how common double damage is in this game, you aren't even going to see any benefit from your first health upgrade. You're instead gonna have to wait until your second health upgrade to gain an additional hit point. That's 8 mask shards for 1 measly extra hit point. And it's not like mask shards are easy to come by either. They don't exactly hand these things out. Most of them are pretty well hidden. In fact, they're so well hidden that I finished Act 2 with only 6 masks. And it's not like I didn't explore either. I beat the game with most of the map uncovered, as well as obtaining every movement ability. I even obtained the double jump by surviving the arduous trek through Mount Fae, which is essentially this game's equivalent to the White Palace. I shouldn't have to have a wiki open to find something as basic as a health upgrade. I want to play through the game organically, but with how consistently punishing this game is, with just how well hidden many of the upgrades are, that's apparently not a very optimal or even valid playstyle. They should have either reduced the amount of mask shards that you need from 4 to 3, or simply made the mask shards themselves more plentiful. The way it is now is both too scarce and also not rewarding enough. You could make the argument that this encourages you to go out and explore, but I would argue the opposite. If anything, it encourages you to have a wiki open, at the very likely chance that you miss something important, but it gets even better. These basic mobs that not only deal more damage to you, but also take more hits to defeat, don't even drop the primary currency when defeated, and instead drop a much less valuable secondary currency. And the primary currency, the rosaries, are instead reserved for the pilgrim type enemies, which there are far much less of, especially in the early game. So with basic mobs being as spongy as they are, dealing as much damage as they do, and also not dropping anything worthwhile, I often found myself avoiding combat altogether, which is not at all the case in the OG Hollow Knight, as the primary currency in that game, Geo, was far more common to come by. But Tachunga, I hear you say. There is in fact a very good reason for some of those enemies to not drop any rosaries. Shit, well, this better be a pretty good reason. Of course it's a good reason, I hear you say, and it's all tied to the game's lore.
I'm not making myself clear. I don't give a fuck.
So what, lore now supersedes game design? So let's talk about a completely unrelated game for a moment, The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. In that game, there's this area called the Depths. And if you haven't played that game before, essentially it's a giant underground network that exists beneath the surface of Hyrule. It's a pretty cool concept in theory, but only in theory, because in practice, it's a giant empty fucking wasteland that has nothing of value in it outside of 2 story dungeons, for an area that is equivalent in size to the surface of Hyrule. Now, you could probably make the argument that there are very valid lore and story related reasons for the depths being as empty as it is, and again, those would probably be pretty valid reasons. But do those reasons make the depths themselves any less empty? Or more fun to explore? The same can be said about the rosaries in Silksong. Like, the fact that there's lore tied to the rosaries, does that somehow magically make the dogshit economy not dogshit? If your answer to that question is anything but no, you might be cooked.
Yep, we are absolutely cooked, chat. GG.
While it may be a cool detail that only the pilgrims carry the rosaries, they should have never sacrificed the actual in-game economy for this, and simply had all enemy types drop the rosaries. Or if the rosaries are really that important to the lore, then simply make the primary currency something else. The way it is now just leads to you grinding for resources. And Team Cherry themselves seem to realize this because there are several grinding spots in the game, where there are conveniently placed rosary dispensaries next to a bunch of pilgrim-type enemies. And while some more staunch Silksong defenders may dismiss this as a perfectly serviceable solution,
The sacred Jedi text!
if you ask me, it's just yet another way that Silksong wastes your time. And what makes this even worse is that on top of being scarce, you also need the rosaries for incredibly basic functions, such as for benches or even fast travel points. Although some points of fast travel were also locked behind currency in the OG Hollow Knight, but it made a bit more sense in that game, with how plentiful Geo was. In Silksong, it feels like insult to injury, or just rubbing salt in the wound, especially with just how expensive some of these benches and Bellways are. Some of the benches in this game can cost up to 90 rosaries to unlock, and it's not as if these more expensive benches are somehow redundant or something that you wouldn't really need. No, these more expensive benches are often placed where there's no other checkpoints nearby, leaving you completely screwed if you don't have the rosaries on hand. But in this game, you might consider yourself lucky if you simply can't afford to unlock a bench, because there are actually fake-out benches in this game that can kill you. Why do these exist? Because Team Cherry hates you, that's why. I guess they hate you for making them filthy rich. There is of course the infamous fake-out bench in Bilewater that drops you into a pool of maggots when you try to rest on it, but I'd actually like to focus our attention to one of these benches that's a bit earlier on, and that would be the one in Hunter's March. The Hunter's March is a fairly early game area, likely to be one of the first areas you visit in the game, and in this area, there's quite a lengthy stretch of some precision-based platforming, where you have to pogo off a series of red flowers in a row, while also avoiding spike pits and some pretty tanky enemies, which on its own is likely to be already enough for many new players to worry about, because at this point, you'll still be in the process of learning the new diagonal pogo, and likely won't have yet mastered it, or likely found any other crests. But instead of giving you a bench at the end of this lengthy platforming gauntlet, Team Cherry instead decides to give you a mini-boss, where you have to fight through several waves of enemies. And if you die at any point during this encounter, it's all the way back to the start for you. But surely after enduring not only this lengthy platforming gauntlet, but also fighting your way through several waves of enemies, they would at the very least give you a bench after, right? Yes, but not the kind you wanted. I think this quote sums up my thoughts perfectly. And in keeping with the theme of wasting the player's time, the most egregious way in which Silksong does this is none other than the boss runbacks, which, out of anything in this game, is no doubt going to pose the biggest challenge for all of the Team Cherry sexuals to defend. Because, yeah, pretty much everyone universally hates these. And for good reason. They serve to accomplish nothing but waste the player's time. And Silksong is chock full of them. But not only is it chock full of them, it also very likely has the worst runbacks that this genre has ever seen, sometimes placing the nearest bench up to several minutes away from the actual boss room. I'm looking forward to the one comment detailing how this is somehow a good thing, but thankfully I won't waste your time like Team Cherry and rattle off every egregious runback in this game, and instead just highlight one, and that would be the runback to the last judge. And I did kind of sort of lie because I am going to waste your time just a little bit, and that's because I'm going to showcase the entire runback here to emphasize my point. Enjoy! Now, imagine doing that every time you want to reface the boss. This runback made me hate the last judge, which is unfortunate, because the runback aside, the fight itself is actually quite good. There aren't just a bunch of random ads thrown into the fight, like many of the other bosses in the game. There's pretty good visual clarity, and her moves are pretty well telegraphed. Or I'm assuming it's a her. I mean, most of the other bosses in this game are all female, for some reason. I mean, you got Moss Mother, Brood Mother, Sister Splinter.
Girls get it done.
With just how many female bad guys there are in this game, you'd think they'd be better served in a game where all the characters aren't bugs. I mean, I don't think too many people are gonna rub one out to whatever the fuck this is.
Oh, this sucks. I can't jack off to this. Damn it.
And I should maybe clarify that I don't think all boss runbacks are just universally bad. I think some can actually be done well. You know, stuff like adding shortcuts so you can get back to the boss more quickly, or adjusting the length of the runback in accordance with the difficulty of the boss. This is actually something that the Souls games do pretty well. Dark Souls 1, for example, has some pretty lengthy runbacks, but the bosses in that game are also quite a bit easier, especially when compared to something like Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring, which in turn makes the runbacks themselves far more palatable. I mean, if you die to the Gaping Dragon, do you really have anyone but yourself to blame? And then as the series goes on and the bosses continually get harder, they also reduce the length of the runbacks. It only makes sense. But in Silksong, not only have they made the bosses themselves more difficult, but even the runbacks are longer now in some cases. Make it make sense. Wait. Runbacks aside, I enjoy the vast majority of the bosses in this game. I know that I said this video was mostly going to focus on the negatives, but I would, however, like to highlight just a couple of my favorite bosses. The Lace fight was fairly honest and straightforward. Most of her attacks are pretty well telegraphed, and she also has clear openings where you can get some pretty good damage in. I thought that the fourth chorus was a very good spectacle fight. Similar to Lace, his moves are well telegraphed, and despite being a larger enemy, you don't take contact damage, which I thought was a nice change of pace, because so many of the enemies deal contact damage in this game for some reason. And they also make pretty good use of the ability that you acquire just in the area prior. And wouldn't you know it, Team Cherry actually made a good duo boss fight. The Cogwork Dancers are just about everything good with duo boss fights, without any of the bad. These autonomous crickets attack in sync with one another, clearly defining both the speed and the tempo of the fight. which only leaves yourself to blame if you accidentally fall out of rhythm, and they perfectly escalate the stakes in this boss's last phase, where they now have the dancers desync from one another and attack out of rhythm, which really kind of forces you to adapt on the fly, but not in an overly punishing or annoying way, like adding additional mobs or spamming a bunch of projectiles. I may think some of the early game bosses do a bit too much damage, or that there may be one too many gank fights, but that aside, when it comes down to it, Team Cherry still clearly knows how to design an incredibly good boss fight, and far be it for me to say otherwise. And despite this game pissing me off at a nearly constant basis, there were very few points where I actually considered dropping the game. Really only two, the first being the run back to the last judge, and the other being the combat arena found in the Citadel closer towards the end of Act 2, where you have to fight through 10 waves of enemies in a row without dying, and then ending in a final wave where you have to fight 2 mini-bosses at the same time. Excluding maybe Act 3, this is the single most difficult combat encounter in the entire game. Easily more difficult than the final boss. Why make this absurdly difficult combat arena a mandatory fight for just simply finishing the game? And it's not like you even get anything for doing this. You don't get any sort of reward or upgrade. You simply just get to keep playing. If this exact same combat arena had been in the original Hollow Knight, it would have not only been optional, but it would have also rewarded you with something actually worthwhile, like a Pale Ore or a Notch upgrade. In Silksong, you get fuck all.
Now that's what I call a bowel movement.
So, is Silksong too hard? I mean, maybe? The early game is, at the very least. I don't even think that's a question. As for the rest of the game, not as much. I definitely think there's an argument to be made, but that's not really my hang-up with this game. There are plenty of video games that are quote-unquote too hard that I don't have any issues with. No, my issue with Silksong is that it blatantly disrespects your time. If Silksong was simply just another difficult video game, I wouldn't have bothered to make this video. It's specifically the ways in which Silksong goes about achieving this difficulty. Unreasonably long runbacks, enemies that take too many hits to defeat, basic functions being locked behind currency, and then said currency being hamstrung for seemingly innocuous reasons. These are all things that make Silksong more difficult than the original Hollow Knight, but they're also all things that make Silksong far more tedious as well, and in a way that Hollow Knight never was. Over the years, the original Hollow Knight has definitely built up a reputation for being a fairly punishing game. Challenging combat, precise platforming, and some pretty difficult boss fights are all things that certainly helped Hollow Knight garner this reputation, but I wouldn't count tedium among them. For as difficult as the original Hollow Knight ever got, it rarely, if ever, wasted the player's time. Silksong wastes your time at a nearly constant basis, from the opening hours all the way until the end credits, and even longer for those who decide to brave Act 3. For as good of a sequel as Silksong admittedly is, I also feel like somewhere along the line, Team Cherry missed the point of what made the original Hollow Knight so appealing in the first place. I didn't like the original Hollow Knight because it was overly punishing or unreasonably difficult. I liked it because it was tough but fair. It seems as though in their pursuit of making Hollow Knight but harder, Team Cherry lost sight of this, and ended up making a game that feels unnecessarily tedious in the process. And to tie this wrap up into a point that I raised earlier on in the video, I would like to draw a parallel between Silksong and Tears of the Kingdom, because no, I didn't bring up Tears of the Kingdom solely just to shit on it, although that was definitely a nice bonus. I chose to bring up that game in particular because I believe as sequels, both Tears of the Kingdom and Silksong share quite a bit in common. They're both sequels to highly critically acclaimed games. They both not only reuse the same art style from the previous game, but also control nearly identically as well. They both initially started off development as DLCs, that were then later on expanded into full-on sequels. And despite the both of them reusing quite a bit from the previous entries, both Tears of the Kingdom and Silksong took far longer to come out than anyone would have expected. with Tears of the Kingdom taking more than 6 years to release after Breath of the Wild, and with Silksong taking an even longer 8 years to release after the original Hollow Knight. And despite both Silksong and Tears of the Kingdom feeling so similar to the previous games, because of the few new mechanics that they do introduce, they both end up providing vastly different experiences from the originals, but funnily enough, for completely different reasons. At the time of its release, Breath of the Wild threw a much-needed wrench into the open-world formula by creating a series of emergent mechanics that actually impacted the moment-to-moment gameplay. Things like the terrain or the weather are things that you probably wouldn't even think about in many other open-world games. But in Breath of the Wild, these mechanics fundamentally changed how you approached exploration. It created sort of a new type of fun in a very tired and very stale formula. And Tears of the Kingdom completely undermined this with its silly nuts and bolts building mechanics that allow you to build vehicles that completely ignore the weather and terrain, just completely trivializing the exploration, which, as a sequel to Breath of the Wild, feels just a little bit weird and also out of place. But where Tears of the Kingdom removed friction, Silksong creates it. But whereas the friction sparks freedom and creativity in many other games, the friction in Silksong instead feels restrictive and overly punishing, to the point where it merely just pads out the runtime. I mean, really, if you were to remove all of the tedious aspects from Silksong, the runbacks, the Spongey enemies, made the rosaries more plentiful, made benches and Bellways cost less, or God forbid, nothing at all, if you removed all of this unnecessary bullshit, it would probably cut Silksong's runtime in half. It would probably end up being pretty similar in length to the original Hollow Knight, because Silksong's map is pretty similar in size to Hollow Nest. It's definitely a little bit bigger, but not by that much. I actually think a lot of Silksong's design makes a bit more sense when you look at it through the lens of it initially starting off as a DLC. The restrictive currency, the expensive benches, the lengthy runbacks, all of these things are far less likely to wear out their welcome in a much shorter 10 to 15 hour campaign. But in a 50 to 100 hour fully fledged sequel, these very same systems completely wear out their welcome. We live in the bad timeline. We live in a timeline where we didn't get the 10 to 15 hour well-balanced expansion that Silksong was supposed to be, that didn't take 8 years to develop and was instead out in 3 to 4 years. And Team Cherry was instead already on to their next project. We live in a timeline where we got shitty building mechanics in Breath of the Wild sequel, instead of a game that expanded upon the emergent systems that made the first game so unique. We live in a timeline where we only got 2 seasons of Mindhunter, but somehow got 4 seasons of this garbage. And so, because we live in the bad timeline, I unfortunately cannot recommend Hollow Knight Silksong, despite me thinking it's a pretty good game. But being a good game isn't enough to offset the tedium that you're subjecting yourself to. There are far better, less tedious options in this genre that actually respect your time. And before you even say it, that yes, you can also get for just 20 bucks. Sorry, I know I'm kind of breaking the narrative here. I'm forcibly unplugging you from the Matrix. But yes, there are indeed other indie games that only cost $20. I know there are a lot of YouTube shills and fanboys that don't want you to know that, but it's true. Not only that, but you can also get indie Metroidvanias for just 20 bucks. Blasphemous, Ori and the Blind Forest, Animal Well, Ender Lilies, and Ender Magnolia, or Sultan Sanctuary, which I'm pretty sure is under $20. Also, it did the whole adapting the Souls-like formula into a 2D game thing, long before Hollow Knight ever did, but it has a worse art style, so no one cares. Point being, there are plenty of other games in this genre that cost a similar amount. Team Cherry aren't the saviors of gaming for charging $20 for this game, and you're not better off buying Silksong instead of one of these other games. I know that might sound a bit harsh, but the way people talk about this game is like it's some generational masterpiece, when it's really not. It's Hollow Knight with extra steps. But I guess having your time needlessly wasted is the ultimate test of player skill.
If it's not fun, why bother?
And I'm sure I lost at least a few of you by saying I don't recommend this game, but I can recommend any number of good to great games, or heavily flawed games that have at least a few redeeming qualities. And I can even recommend games that inconvenience you, as long as that inconvenience serves a purpose. But what I cannot recommend is a game that doesn't respect your time.